The flight instructor called her grandma. Then a two-star general asked, "Where did you learn that?" At Millbrook County Airfield, everyone called her grandma. Not out of disrespect, but because 71-year-old Eleanor Whitfield had been teaching young pilots to fly for almost 20 years, and something about her calm voice made even the most nervous student feel safe. She wore the same tan jumpsuit every day, carried a scratched-up white flight helmet under her arm, and never talked about her life before Millbrook. When students asked where she learned to fly like that, she would smile and say only one thing: somewhere far from here. Nobody pushed further. Nobody expected there was anything to push for. She was just Grandma, the sweet old instructor who taught teenagers and career changers how to read a horizon and trust an engine. But Eleanor had not always flown Cessnas over cornfields. 30 years earlier, she had been Lieutenant Colonel Eleanor Whitfield, one of only a handful of women accepted into a classified experimental flight program. She flew aircraft that never appeared in public records, tested maneuvers that were later erased from training manuals, earned a reputation among a small circle of officers as the calmest hand in the sky. Then, after a mission that never made the news, she walked away from it all. She traded a cockpit full of secrets for a quiet runway and a folding chair beside a windsock, and she never looked back. Or so she told herself. On a gray Tuesday morning, a young cadet named Marcus climbed into a training plane beside her. He was 18, eager, and terrified of stalling the engine. Eleanor buckled her harness the way she always did, slow and deliberate, and told him the same thing she told every new student: the plane is not your enemy. Fear is. They took off into a sky heavy with clouds. Halfway through the lesson, the engine sputtered. Then it died completely. Marcus froze, his hands locked on the controls, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Eleanor did not raise her voice. She simply placed her hand over his and said one word: breathe. What happened next lasted less than 90 seconds, but it would be talked about at that airfield for years. Eleanor guided the small plane through a controlled descent that should not have been possible at that altitude. She used a recovery technique so precise, so unconventional, that even the tower controller watching from the ground stopped mid-sentence. The plane touched down on the grass strip beside the runway, rolling to a smooth stop as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Marcus sat frozen, tears streaming down his face, alive because of a maneuver he had never once seen in any manual. What none of them knew was that a two-star general, in town for a regional aviation safety conference, had been standing near the fence line that morning, watching the lesson through binoculars out of pure boredom. He had seen thousands of pilots in his 40-year career. He had never seen anyone recover an engine failure the way this silver-haired woman just had. He walked across the tarmac, his aide trailing behind him, and found Eleanor kneeling beside the plane, checking on her shaking student. The general studied her face for a long moment. Then he asked the question that would change everything. "Where did you learn that?" Eleanor rose slowly, wiping grass from her knees, and for the first time in 30 years, she did not deflect the question. She looked the general in the eye and said only 3 words: "Whiskey Delta 7. The general's face went pale. Whiskey Delta 7 was not just a call sign. It was a designation buried so deep in classified archives that only a handful of living officers even knew it had existed. He had spent years trying to identify the pilot behind those initials, a pilot whose maneuvers had saved 2 aircraft and 3 crews during operations that officially never happened. He had been standing in front of a legend for the last hour and had no idea. Words spread quietly at first, then faster than anyone could stop it. Reporters from the regional paper wanted interviews. Former officers reached out after decades of silence. The airfield owner offered to name the runway after her. Eleanor turned down almost all of it. She did not want a statue or a headline. She wanted her students to keep flying. And she wanted Marcus to understand that fear had a name, and it was not failure. A week later, the general returned to Millbrook, this time in full uniform, with a small wooden case in his hands. Inside was a medal Eleanor had never been allowed to receive, sealed away decades earlier for reasons of classification that no longer applied. He pinned it to her jumpsuit himself, right there on the grass strip, in front of a small crowd of students who finally understood why their teacher's hands never shook. Marcus stood at the front of that crowd, still processing that the woman who taught him to breathe through panic had once done the same thing at speeds and altitudes he could not imagine. When the ceremony ended, he approached her one more time and asked the question everyone had been too afraid to ask. "Grandma, why did you stop flying like that?" Eleanor smiled the way she always did, gentle and unreadable, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I did not stop flying like that," she said. "I just started teaching other people to fly the same way. Calm first, fear second. Skill will always find you if you survive long enough to learn it." She picked up her helmet, tucked it under her arm, and walked toward the next student waiting by the runway. Just another quiet morning at Millbrook. Except now, everyone finally understood who had been teaching them all along. If this story moved you, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing what part touched you most, and subscribe for more emotional stories that remind us who our quiet heroes really are.